Hi there. Today's video is going to be a little different than the rest. The videos on this channel are invitations to slow down, to check in with what's going on inside of you in your internal world, what some counselors or people in spiritual formation would call parts of self. And what I'm going to do in this video is just offer a few thoughts on what that means if all of this is brand new to you. Just a bit of an orientation to the space and the purposes of the space. So if you have never heard anything about parts work and that sounds kind of crazy or sounds like multiple personalities to you, I'll just give you a little introduction into what models use this in the counseling world and in the spiritual formation world. So, the most common model that people know is something called internal family systems, and it goes by IFS. The developer of this model is named Richard Schwartz, and he's written a lot of books. He has some great videos right here on YouTube, and so you can certainly find free resources to learn about the model. And basically, it's an understanding of people and how all of us, it's not just people who go to counseling or people who need special help, but all of us as people, an observation of how we are wired is that we are multifaceted. And in being multifaceted, it is helpful to understand our internal system of these facets or these parts or these dimensions of that larger holistic self in order to develop and grow as a person, in order to resolve internal conflicts. And this is why it's a really great model that can be intersected with spiritual formation. Looking at it from the perspective of ways we might be stuck in our spiritual growth or our spiritual journey, ways that we might be stuck even if we're really trying to engage in spiritual disciplines or grow in our faith. And other ways that this general way of thinking is used in the counseling or therapy world, if you've ever heard of people talk about doing inner child work, that's another way that this is used. There are certain models, like emotionally focused therapy, that has an individual version called EFIT that looks at what are some of the kind of internal cycles that we go through, and that would understand our internal world in a similar way. If it's helpful, if you are in the counseling or therapy world, if it's helpful to know, my background and training is very much influenced by the work of Janina Fisher, who uses an integration of a couple different parts models in her work. And my journey with parts work really intersected in my trainings with Janina Fisher alongside personal work that I was doing with a spiritual director. And the spiritual director just happens to also be a licensed therapist. And even though this intersection wasn't intentional, it was just one of those things that kind of happened. As I was doing my own personal work and processing, as I was doing my training and doing work professionally, there were these intersections that I just couldn't ignore and that really fascinated me. And as I saw this work powerfully move things in my own life, in my own spirit and soul, I got to see that happening in people's lives right in front of me as well. So I got this really interesting perspective, both personally and professionally. And what I love about parts work, and I use the term parts work more generally. I'm not an IFS purist. I don't purely go by one model. Like I said, my background is more in integration and understanding from a few different perspectives on how to understand parts of us. And doing that both from a clinical perspective as a counselor, but also from a spiritual formation perspective, especially since that was the first place I encountered this personally in a kind of ongoing therapeutic way. But when thinking about parts work or utilizing parts work as a whole, I love that it creates this just common ground humanity, if you will. That even if I'm sitting in front of someone as a clinician, as a licensed counselor who has my credentials, my expertise, all those things, there's something so dignifying, I think, something so shared in our humanity of understanding parts of myself as we explore parts of this person in their life in a way that can be healing and freeing and unburdening. So for me, it's a really powerful model in that I think it really strips us down to kind of the bare bones of what it means to be human, down to really, raw foundational parts of ourselves that might have long lasting wounds, almost these ancient roots that go very far back into our stories, into our being, our existence as people. Um, whatever our lifespan looks like. And so I think this can be helpful whether we're 20 and we're trying to make sense of life right now in the last 20 years, or if we're 65 and we're trying to make sense of the present in the last 65 years. So wherever you are in your life and your journey, wherever you are with things like counseling or things like spiritual formation, I encourage you just to be curious about this idea of parts. So if it sounds crazy right now, that's okay. Just embrace that it sounds crazy, and let yourself be curious to explore what might this look like in your life, might this look like in someone else's life that you know. Another important note, in addition to just saying, okay, when I say parts work, I'm talking about most generally we as people are multifaceted. Another thing that I think is really important alongside this when integrating anything with what's often termed, faith and psychology, or Christianity and psychology, I think it's just really important to go back to the roots of what does psychology mean. Psychology put together comes from two Greek words, the first one being what we would often refer to as the psyche, but it comes from this Greek word that means soul, that means life. And then our ending, we have that same ending in things like even theology, which is, study of God. And so it's study of the soul is our most basic meaning. And I understand that today when we say psychology, we often mean things like academic research or clinical trials, or someone sitting down and studying the mind and the subconscious. And I understand that the way we use the word today doesn't necessarily stay true to that most basic root original meaning of the word. The point that I'm trying to make is that I think we can take this most raw original meaning of the word and see that it doesn't have to be threatening or scary when we engage that with our faith, but actually all over scripture, we get windows into the soul, and we see this wrestling of what does it look like for the human soul to know God, to commune with God, to be in relationship with God. How does God engage with us? In a way that's not surface level, that's not just behavior, but in a way that really enters in and speaks to our souls, redeems our souls, transforms our souls. And so that's my heart. That's my intention with this, is not just to take some scientific or clinical approach and say, here, use this. You don't need your faith. You don't need scripture. You don't need community. My heart in this is to say, hey, here's a really great tool and resource that I think does get to the foundations of how God has wired us as people, that helps us understand what it means to be human. And it's important to understand what it means to be human in our relationship with God, because as humans, we bear God's image. We are created by Him. And in relationship with Him, God-human relationship, if we don't have a helpful understanding of what it means to be human, that's probably going to impact how we view God, how we view a relationship with Him. A lot of things could get muddied up and could get distorted. And so I do think it is worthwhile and God honoring to pause and really explore and understand what it means to be human, both at large and also specifically in our circumstance, in the embodied existence that we carry in our unique story, our unique life experience. So that's some of the background in terms of really understanding, okay, parts of self, what does that mean? I'll keep it very simple here and give you resources, and they will also be in the description below this video. In short, the most basic way we can understand parts of us, or kind of categorize parts of us, are to understand we have protective parts of us and vulnerable parts of us. Now, that thing called IFS that I referenced earlier, it has a whole kind of framework of language that they use for these different parts, and that can be helpful. I think it can also be helpful just to make it as simple as a protective part of us and a vulnerable part of us. So this might look like whenever I'm in an uncomfortable situation or I feel anxious, I might have a protective part of me that tries to either get me out of that situation or kind of shuts down. And either of those things serves the function of protecting a vulnerable part of me that's really uncomfortable, that maybe feels really exposed, or that maybe feels something like shame that really doesn't feel good. And so when thinking about parts of us, we can see these different nuances, these different facets or layers of what goes on. It's a way to almost anchor down our emotions, our thoughts, our reactions, things that we sometimes can't make sense of, right? We might know what we're feeling, but we might not be able to understand, why do I do this? We've maybe done something a million times and think, I never want to do that again. And it keeps coming up, it keeps happening. And understanding protective functions of protective parts of us and how they protect vulnerable, wounded, hurting, scared parts of us can give us a lot of helpful understanding that moves us away from shaming ourselves from behavior that we're not happy with and moving us toward a compassion that isn't just a light, fluffy, surface level self-compassion that, is maybe talked about today. It's more a sense of embodying and embracing God's mercy and compassion that we see embodied in the life of Christ. And so much of this truly is anchored in essentials of our faith, essentials in who God is, his nature, his loving kindness, his compassion that's just intrinsic to who he is and how he engages us. So I know a lot of this probably feels like just little snippets, but I want to keep this video as brief as I can and invite you to consider looking into resources, whether it be about IFS in particular, or some integrations. There are some books out there. One is called Boundaries for Your Soul. That's a integration with spiritual formation. There's also a book called Altogether You, which gives you a pretty straightforward look at IFS from a Christian perspective. And then there's a great podcast called The One Inside, and you'll actually see authors of these two books that are interviewed on that podcast, and it gives you just an idea of IFS, different things to consider with parts work, and it does specifically utilize that one model called internal family systems. So wherever you are, know that this is a journey that can be hard to walk alone. And so I encourage you, and this is going to be listed under every video, I really do encourage you to be processing this with trusted people around you. And while that might be a trusted friend or a trusted mentor, oftentimes what we might most need, even just for a season, is a professional counselor or a spiritual director or someone who is familiar with these models. And so if that's not something that you have in your life, I encourage you to utilize online resources like Psychology Today. You can actually go on to the IFS Institute website and find clinicians who are trained in IFS, which would mean they are trained in parts work, or that's something that you can look at in bios or descriptions of counselors on places like Psychology Today. So definitely don't think of this as a substitute for therapy or therapeutic work. It's definitely not. This is a complement to a larger processing of whether it's therapeutic work or soul work, and really looking to create an intersection for those things. So in the playlists, you'll find different options to just slow down. They're really guided forms of what's often called, mindfulness or meditation. There's explicit Christian integration in these. And if you have any specific questions or comments that you feel like aren't answered in this video or others, please feel free to leave your feedback for me, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. I hope that these are a blessing to all parts of your soul, especially the parts of you that have maybe been hidden or tucked away, that maybe feel unseen or shamed. And really, please know that this is a space where every single part of you is invited to be known and to be embraced, first and foremost by God's grace, His compassion, His mercy. And my hope is that will spill over into your own relationship with different parts of your soul, and then how your soul is able to interact with those in your life and community around you. Thank you. Let's begin.